Something we hear a lot from people who run our programs is that they finish one and then they immediately want to start the next one, or that their goals or preferences shifted part way and they want to switch to something different, which is actually how training should work. It should adapt to you as things change. Now, the problem is buying programs one at a time. Every time that happens, well, that can be hard on the wallet. So we built Barbell Medicine Premium. One subscription and you get the entire program library in our app, all the strength, hypertrophy, conditioning, rehab, general fitness, beginner programs, and everything in between. You can switch whenever you want. And as new programs get added, you get them in the subscription. No per program fees ever. Austin and I build and maintain every program and podcast in both libraries. Same people, the same standards as everything else we put out, now all in one place. It's $19.95 a month, $199 for the year. You can cancel anytime. And if you already subscribe to Barbell Medicine Plus or the programming library separately, you can upgrade and we'll sort it out so that you're not paying twice. Link is in the description below. Check it out now. All right, picture the people you'd bet were the least likely to ever get stronger. Not athletes and not gym people, but nursing home residents in their late 80s and 90s. Some on canes and a couple in wheelchairs. Now, back in 1990, a researcher named Dr. Maria Fiatarone took 10 of them and did the thing that everyone assumed would just hurt them. She put them on real, heavy strength training. 8 weeks later, they'd nearly tripled their leg strength, and a few of them put their canes down for good. Now, that was 35 years ago. If a frail 90-year-old can nearly triple her strength with resistance training, the idea that a healthy 50-year-old has somehow aged out of building muscle and strength is dead on arrival. And yet, a whole industry has grown up around menopause, telling women that the rules are different for them now, that they need a special menopause-specific approach, a particular protocol, a way of training built entirely around their hormones, usually with a stack of supplements to go with it. And today, we're going to put that to the test. I'm Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum. This is the Barbell Medicine Podcast. This is part 4 of our 4-part menopause series. It's the last one, and it's the one where we stop describing the problem and actually tell you what to do about it. And I want to be clear up front why this matters, because it's got nothing to do with bigger guns. The thing that actually kills women after menopause isn't a hormone, it's heart disease by a mile. And the thing that actually takes their independence is a fall, the fracture, that slow slide into a nursing home. Your cardiorespiratory fitness is one of the strongest predictors of how long you'll live, and your muscular function is what keeps you off the floor. Postmenopausal women with low muscle mass have about a double the risk of falling and almost triple the risk of fracture. So when we talk about training today, the stakes aren't vanity. The stakes are how long you live and how good that life is. And here to walk through what training actually does for a woman in her late 40s and beyond, while half of the internet is selling her a proprietary program, a supplement stack, and a coach to oversee both of them, is the second most handsome doctor in North America, Dr. Austin Baraki. What's going on, man?
Hey, some thorny topics that we might be getting into here, but we'll do our best.
Trying to be charitable while also controversial. That's what the internet wants.
I guess so.
So let's talk about training first. So the training that works for a perimenopausal woman is the training that works for any healthy adult. That's our main claim here. There is a famous trial that came out in 2023, the Isenmann trial. And I think that's one of the strongest single pieces of evidence that we have. Let's talk through it. The setup here. Isenmann and colleagues at the German Sport University in Cologne published this in 2023. They took 41 women. The mean age was 52, plus or minus about 4 years. They classified each one of them as either premenopausal or postmenopausal based on their FSH levels. That's a follicle stimulating hormone. That's the pituitary hormone that climbs when ovarian estrogen output goes down. And they have got a 12-month diary of their periods. Now, 17 of the premenopausal women trained at moderate intensity, which was about 75% of the 1 rep max, twice a week for 10 weeks. And then 24 postmenopausal women were split between the same moderate intensity training program and then a lower intensity version where they trained at 50% of their 1 rep max. We're going to focus on the moderate intensity comparison, which is the head-to-head comparison between pre and postmenopausal women. Now, they were doing legitimate free weight training. They were doing squats, bench press, and deadlift variants. Now, some people listening to this would be like, what kind of squats were they? Well, it was with a barbell. So that's good. It was to a box, however, so not exactly a regular barbell squat, but the bench press was with free weights. So real movements, nonetheless, with real weight. The results, after 10 weeks, The squat 1 rep max in the premenopausal group went from 48.5 kilograms to 68.5 kilograms, a 61% increase. In the postmenopausal group on the same program, squat 1 rep max went from 36.3 kilos to 71 kilos, a 65% increase. And the bench press told the same story. Premenopausal group went up 18%, whereas the postmenopausal group went up 22%. Now, if we just started right there, this looks like a PED. Just go postmenopausal and your gains will increase. But I think overall, these are gains that someone new to lifting on a real lifting program tends to produce. And in postmenopausal women on a standard barbell program, they seem to respond just fine. To me, that's the real headline. Now, there's a little nuance here, a little wrinkle with respect to hypertrophy or muscle growth. And I want to go through this slowly because this kind of gets overlooked, not only by people just scan the abstract, but also in some of the stuff that happens on social media. When the authors measured muscle thickness directly using ultrasound on the quadriceps, so the legs, both groups showed an increase in growth. The rectus femoris thickness went up in the premenopausal group and the postmenopausal group. The vastus lateralis, that's another group in your muscle in your quadriceps, that went up as well in both groups. While the premenopausal group showed slightly larger changes, the postmenopausal group on the same program added a similar level of muscle thickness. There were no statistically significant differences between groups. Now, if you just took that on its own, you'd say, well, look, they got stronger and they got bigger and there were no changes. What's the big deal here? Why are you focusing on this? Well, when they tried to estimate how much muscle mass they actually gained using bioelectrical impedance, a different picture appeared. Premenopausal group showed a small gain, whereas postmenopausal group showed essentially no change, actually a loss of fat-free mass. The problem is that you got two different measurements in the same trial, but different stories depending on how you interpret them. With direct measurement, again, muscle thickness, both groups grew. Overlapping effect sizes, no statistical separation between them. Indirectly measuring using BIA, bioelectrical impedance, only the premenopausal group registered a gain. DEXA, which is the gold standard clinical tool for body composition and bone mineral density, is not precise enough to reliably detect a lean mass change of about 1.5 kilos or less in a single person. Bioelectrical impedance, which is what this trial used, is even worse. So to me, I can kind of ignore that because I'm like, look, I wouldn't expect bioelectrical impedance to pick up even a 3 kilogram change in actual muscle tissue. To me, the ultrasound is far more telling here. Now, the author's own interpretation of this was that postmenopausal women probably need more weekly sets of training to drive the same hypertrophy response as compared to premenopausal women. That is consistent with the mechanistic story we'll get into here in a minute. Estrogen, estradiol specifically, appears to sensitize muscle to the anabolic stimulus of mechanical loading in a way. And when it goes down, the same training stimulus might do a little less work per set. That is a theory, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But for me, overall, the headline for trainability is as follows. Strength gains are essentially preserved across the menopausal status. On the direct measurement of muscle thickness, both groups grew. Whether postmenopausal women need more weekly volume to match premenopausal hypertrophy is an open question that this trial doesn't really answer, but I think not. So here's the claim that the whole menopause fitness industry is built upon. Once your estrogen drops, your muscle stops responding the way that it used to. The training that worked at age 35 doesn't cut it anymore. So now you need a special program using a special protocol that's built for your hormones. That's the pitch, and it's everywhere. Now, if that were true, here's what you would expect to see. When you compared women who were premenopausal and training to postmenopausal women who were also training, well, the postmenopausal should get less out of the same amount of training. Less strength, less muscle, etc. Let's see if that holds up in the data. In 2026, Edward Isenmann's group went and looked at this about as thoroughly as anyone ever has. They pulled together 126 separate training studies, around 4,000 women, and some of those studies were run in premenopausal women, some in postmenopausal women. So they pooled the gains from each group and put them side by side. If menopause really blunted their response, the postmenopausal results should come out lower. But they didn't. The strength gains were basically the same on both sides. The muscle, same story. Fat loss, also the same on both sides. There was no meaningful gap between women training before menopause and the women training after. And when they checked whether age or how often the women trained or how long the program ran predicted the results, none of it did. The results are the same from the training regardless of menopause status. Now, Austin, we've talked about the differences between individuals and what they need from their training program. How do you think that applies here versus a sort of post-menopausal specific need? And how would you be able to tell those two things apart?
Yeah, I think that's the crux of this entire podcast, probably a fair amount of this entire series of topics that we're going to keep coming back to, because if the common narratives that are encountered, say, on social media were accurate, so you'll see things, for example, where menopause is described as a, quote, castration level event. And while perhaps biologically there might be some hormonal changes that could be kind of nestled into that umbrella term, it is a pretty dramatic term to use for this sort of thing. Now, how accurately does that reflect the experience of menopause for many women? This is something that I talk with women about every single day in practice at this point, and have helped to manage in terms of treatment and training advice and things like that. There is massive variation in what a woman experiences going through this stage of life. Some much more dramatic symptoms, debilitating symptoms impacting sleep and fatigue and mood and energy and all sorts of things, to where they might see that post and say, yeah, that reflects what I'm experiencing. And others who don't even actually notice that they've gone through it, they have little to no symptoms whatsoever. So there's just massive variability in what this experience is ultimately like. And so if the common narratives were true, to where this is this catastrophic event that you can't build muscle, you can't build strength because of a menopause-specific transition, then the way that you would be able to tell, to your question, is exactly the type of trial that was run that you described above. And so, a way I like to frame these things is, for people who have very strong opinions about this, have a bit of a conversation and say, look, could we come up with and maybe agree on what would be a reasonable trial design look like that would test this? You've seen me play this card before. Mm-hmm. Can we agree that if we took a group of premenopausal women and a group of postmenopausal women, of a reasonably representative sample of just women in the general population, say, and put them on the exact same training program, if there were a truly menopause specific impact that would obliterates your training response, what would you expect to see on the back end of that trial? That presents your initial hypothesis for testing. Mm-hmm. Then you run the study, you do the training program with both groups, and then you look at the results. And so, to your point, the groups were trivially different to not significantly different between groups. That, you can decide if that is enough for you to overturn that hypothesis, but at least it should put a pretty substantial dent in that hypothesis to say, there's probably some biological changes that might happen to trainability, training response, maybe across this. You might say, it feels like it has to be true that there's something there, but perhaps it's maybe not as substantial or not as generalized as maybe I previously thought. In other words, you might shift your confidence in that position a little bit. I think you and I have shifted our confidence in that position quite a lot. That's not to say that we were previously holding the opinion that it just nobody can respond to training afterwards. But this further tempers our confidence in that type of thing. So I think that what we observe in folks is much more of an individual level experience, which is the case across all stages of life, right? People are just different in what types of training they respond better to, not so well to. And that itself might change early career, training career, mid-training career, and later in the training career. And say if we're somebody's coach, part of our job is to try to figure out what's the thing that they need right now to respond and get, approach the goal that they are looking for. So that's kind of my general take, is this is much more of an individual level phenomenon. Now, the last thing I would say is that menopausal symptoms can interfere with other things that are important for your training response. So it may even not be so much of a specific your estrogen level went down that is driving this, but rather that the consequences of some of those changes lead to, for example, substantial sleep disruption. And substantial sleep disruption might be impairing your ability, your energy, your motivation to push in the gym or to recover from the training that you are doing or something like that. Or it might impact your appetite, and that might impact your habitual, dietary tendencies, and that might impact your body composition. And so there are just a web of complex interacting things, which is why, to wrap this up, a lot of the kind of common narratives that are seen on social media that might be either really dramatic or are often really simplified of estrogen down means no more training response. It's essentially the mirror image of what we spent years talking about when we cover testosterone in men, right? Where it's like, oh, if your test isn't this high, sorry, man, like you're just not going to respond to training. It's like, that is also not the case.
Yeah. No, there have been trials on people with frank testosterone deficiency, and lo and behold, they still get stronger. They still gain muscle mass, not as much as if they were in the eugonadal range, but they still respond. And also, just to throw back to, again, one of my favorite people in the sort of aging muscle mass research space, Dr. Feigenbaum, now Feigenbaum Singh, when she did that original study in 1990, where she took the 10 nonagenarians, people in their 90s, and had them do resistance training, and they got stronger. I'm like, oh, that's interesting, but it's only 10 people. Her follow-up trial in 1994 with over 100 people, 63 of them were women, again, in their 80s and 90s. They still got stronger. They still gained muscle mass, and there was no hint of menopause, perimenopause anywhere. Effectively, if it wasn't going to work, you would have seen it in that trial. They still gained muscle mass. They still got stronger. So yeah, the reason that the question Dr. Baraki just walked through is hard to answer, and the reason why a postmenopausal specific need for training is even plausible at all, is that the cell level environment for muscle actually does change at menopause. We're not denying that. And so let's walk through some of those changes. First up, we're going to talk about estrogen and testosterone. Now, they do two different things in the muscle. Obviously, there's some overlap here, and it's not just in isolation, but you can think about testosterone being anabolic, building. It drives the building of new contractile protein. Also has some interesting effects on muscle contractility itself. Estrogen, on the other hand, is more anti-catabolic. It prevents the breakdown or apoptosis, programmed cell death in both muscle and bone, and preserves the function of muscle satellite cells. These are specialized muscle stem cells, if you want to call them that are responsible for muscle repair. Now, across reproductive years, a woman runs on what our book, Signal, calls an estrogen sort of shield. Normal estrogen levels quietly protect muscle and bone from excessive breakdown and preserve the regenerative sort of machinery that allows muscle to recover from training in daily life. Now, estrogen withdrawal is the menopausal event. It is not estrogen and testosterone, because testosterone has been declining gradually since the woman's 30s and 40s. And by the time a woman reaches her final menstrual period, her testosterone is basically stabilized at its new low point. So menopause, you can think of as this estrogen withdrawal layered on top of an already lower androgen, in this case testosterone, baseline. So what changes when this sort of estrogen shield is withdrawn is that the protection against breakdown is also withdrawn. So apoptosis, that programmed cell death in the muscle and bone, tends to go up. Baseline regeneration of muscle and bone drops in the absence of a training stimulus. That's important to note. And so muscle quality, the strength that you can generate per unit of muscle mass, also goes down, and faster than muscle size does, which is the same thing we see in sarcopenia. The menopausal transition does show a measurable drop in jump power and grip strength, even when the lean mass change is small. Okay, so it's kind of all pointing towards the same mechanism. And importantly, this is all in the absence of training, right? Training you can think of as this kind of sledgehammer, right? It can break the shield or overcome what the shield was previously doing. And this does set up this sort of postmenopausal paradox. So on paper, the hormonal environment looks hostile for adding muscle. Estrogen's low, testosterone has been low, and yet postmenopausal women trained on a real program gain strength and muscle at the same rate as premenopausal women. The reason is that the muscle has multiple pathways for anabolic signaling, and mechanical loading activates several of them at once, enough to overcome this hostile environment. It's like a mechanical override here. So when you load the muscle hard enough and often enough, the local growth pathways turn on regardless of what the hormonal milieu looks like. Shout out again to Claude Bernard. There's more going on at the cellular level too. Postmenopausal women, in response to heavy resistance training, show exaggerated recruitment of those stem cells, those satellite cells, compared to younger trained women. It's almost as if the muscle's compensating for the lower baseline regenerative environment by pulling in more of the repair machinery once the mechanical signal arrives. The shield may be down or gone, but the override's still available, and the response seems to be higher than we would otherwise predict. This is the same mechanistic story why menopausal hormonal therapy, or MHT, sort of amplifies training, but it doesn't replace it. When you add estrogen back, it restores some of that shield, although on its own, it only produces modest effects. So there's a DAM 2021 trial that we will talk about later. It's a placebo group plus resistance training. They gained about 4% quadriceps muscle cross-sectional area, so muscle growth. That is the thickness of the 4 big quadriceps muscles measured on MRI, which is the way you'd want to measure that to pick up that small of a change. The group getting estrogen, right, this MHT therapy plus resistance training gained almost 8%. So estrogen made the training response bigger, but the training did a lot of work too. So Austin, imagine a patient comes in and she's read enough online to know that something changes at menopause for muscle and bone. And she wants to know what is happening and what to do about it. How do you talk about this in a way that gives her a real answer without overwhelming her or making her feel like something is broken that she has no control over?
Yeah, I think that, assessing a person's baseline beliefs, where they came from, and then their kind of level of like health and scientific literacy is important in having these conversations, because you're right, it's easy to overwhelm folks. And a lot of the conversation out there probably does come across as pretty overwhelming depending on how far you get into the weeds. And usually when I'm having these kind of conversations with patients, it involves just listening really carefully to the way they describe their question, the types of words that they use. And the more jargon that I start to hear, it's kind of a tip off of like, okay, this person's done some homework, or they might have a higher level of education. They might be a healthcare professional themselves, and I might be able to, engage with them on a different level. Compared with somebody who doesn't necessarily have that background. So just listening carefully helps me assess like where's going to be our meeting point in this conversation. And there's just a lot of different changes that are happening at this period of life. And that's why there can be so much variation, not only between women and what they experience, but also within one of what types of symptoms they experience, ranging from neurological implications, cardiovascular implications. There's these vasomotor symptoms. There's bone changes. There's genitourinary changes. There's lots and lots and lots of things to think about. And then getting a sense of what is the most important thing for the woman. What is her goal? What are her priorities? What's most bothersome? And if we want to pursue, some form of treatment to try to ameliorate these things, what are the potential risks that we're looking at, and what are the potential benefits to try to come up with, a plan out of the large and growing number of treatment options that we have to address various aspects of this. And so, for example, if there are debilitating, symptoms of some variety, then that would be the focus of the conversation. If there are no symptoms whatsoever, then the conversation is going to end up looking a little bit differently, because I think that a lot of what's encountered online makes it really seem that like every single person should be on hormone therapy going through this stage of life, which I don't think is a, position that can be strongly supported in evidence. Whereas there are others for whom using some form of hormone therapy can be very, very clearly justified. And then there are a lot of just in-between cases where there's some judgment involved. There are some potential pros and cons even to different types and formulations and things like that. So I think that, if she in this particular question is mostly concerned with muscle and bone, then yeah, framing the conversation around the goal is to maintain as much of the muscle, bone, and strength as possible going into your later years. When it relates to bone, obviously we're wanting to mitigate the risk of osteoporotic fractures and things like that and the consequences of that. And really, overwhelmingly, we know that providing sufficient mechanical stimulus is, as you said, the sledgehammer for this, right? More important than dietary protein, more important than hormone therapy is getting the stimulus. You can go a long way to maintaining and building muscle and bone with sufficient mechanical stimulus, even in the absence of those other things. Those other things may have a role to play, an adjunctive role, a supportive role, but they should not be the things that are just like overwhelmingly prioritized without sufficient attention to, are we loading things enough to demand the response? Because we know the body will respond one way or another with sufficient dose that is correctly kind of tailored and dosed to the person.
Yeah. I do like the sledgehammer analogy, but I do like also there are additional options for the particular individual. Okay, so before we spend the rest of this episode breaking down what doesn't work, let me just tell you what does. You should lift twice a week. Train all of the major muscle groups using mostly big compound or multi-joint exercises. They should be done heavy enough that the last couple reps are somewhat hard, but not maximal, somewhere around 60 to 80% of your max. You should also do your conditioning, 150 to 300 minutes a week of moderate stuff where you can speak in short sentences, but you can't sing, or about half that amount if you push the intensity. If you're short on time, you trade time for intensity, not the other way around. Eat enough protein, somewhere around 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight, though as low as 1.2 is also fine, as long as you're training. and then progress. As you get stronger, add a little bit of weight over time and keep showing up for years. That's it. That's the whole prescription. And it's basically the same one we'd give any healthy adult. There's no secret menopause program because what works doesn't care about your estrogen level. Now, does the exact amount and type of work need to be fine-tuned to you? Of course, but that's true of everybody at every age, every sex, and every ethnicity. You adjust the program to the person in front of you, not to a number on a hormone panel. Now, what does the program actually look like for a perimenopausal woman? Now, most of what's being sold in the space is built on the premise that the answer is complicated and often proprietary, but let's take a look at the science and see if that backs it up. I hate to break it to anyone who's listening who wants a barbell medicine specific menopausal approach, but the training program is basically the same exercise prescription that we'd give to any healthy adult. For conditioning, we'd want people to engage in at least 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity cardio, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity cardio, or a combination based on preferences and time availability. The less time that you have available to train, the more intensive, the higher intensity your conditioning should be. For resistance training, approximately 2 days per week or more of lifting weights that challenge all of the major muscle groups of the body, ideally with compound multi-joint movements. They should be relatively heavy relative to the individual's current strength level, but not necessarily maximal. Somewhere in that 60 to 80% of a 1-rep max range for sets of 3 to 12 reps with a couple repetitions left in the tank. There is a thought to add in some hops and or jumping into a program designed for a perimenopausal woman. This is a holdover from the LIFTMORE trial that we'll get into later. So effectively in that trial, they saw an increase in bone mineral density, and part of the protocol was that they did jumping pull-ups and landed with straight legs. And so the thought is, by jumping, you introduce this large mechanical stress on the bone. And yes, at a microscopic level, the bone slightly deforms. And as a response, you get an increase in bone mineral density. That's not really evidence-based. It's more vibes-based. I don't think that hops or jumps are bad per se, but if somebody's lifting heavy enough weight, I also don't think that it's necessarily additive. It's just kind of one of those questions that remains open at this time. That said, the menopause fitness market is built on the claim that this woman needs something different, but she doesn't. And in fact, while there's a decent amount of data here, only a few findings in the research come up as menopause specific, even though they're also not. This comes from the Orsatti 2022 trial where 113 postmenopausal women went through a 16-week lifting program. And the first signal that popped up here had to do with training frequency. The authors found that twice weekly training had a higher non-response rate than 3 times per week. And so the recommendation was, well, you got to train at least 3 times a week. But the nuance here is that it's not the frequency. It's not that they were just lifting up 3 days per week versus 2 days per week. It's that they were doing more volume. Frequency is a tool to distribute the training volume, or more specifically, the training load, which is not just how much training you're doing, it's the nature of the training. So for me, I looked at this and I was like, okay, frequency, that's not the thing. They just did more training, which makes sense. There's a dose response across basically every adaptation here.
Yeah, because I can spin this scenario a little bit and ask you, let's take a sample, client that we might be coaching who is, anywhere from 25 to 35 years old. And they've been training twice a week and not getting a great training response. What are you most likely to do?
Yeah.
If they say, I have all the time in the world to train, what would be your next most likely intervention? You might be like, yeah, let's add a 3rd day of training. Yeah. And so that kind of illustrates that this is not necessarily a uniquely menopausal consideration, but rather this is like a fundamental approach to training responsiveness or not, which is much more of an individual level phenomenon. I think it's less likely, for example, that you would have, say, a woman who is training and doing great and getting fantastic gains, training just twice a week leading up to menopause, and then suddenly goes through the transition. And absent, say the impact of menopausal symptoms, disruption of sleep or anything else, absent any of those things, that suddenly the same twice a week training has like no more effect. And suddenly she's like, I'm not responding. The type of person who is already responding well is likely to keep responding well, assuming that most of the other variables of interest, like your sleep and your nutrition and things like that, are in check. But that's also the case across the entire training career. Yeah.
The only sort of frequency specific thing I can think of here that would relate to, let's just call it an untrained or undertrained population is fatigue that accumulates during a workout. So imagine you had this program on paper, but had no number of days associated with it. So you had, 20 exercises, right? And you can do it on one day, you can do it on 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, whatever, split it up however you want. At some point, it's going to be too much exercise in a given session for somebody to actually, again, acquire or accumulate the same training load, meaning that they're going to have to lift lighter, they're going to do less reps, and so training load is going to go down. And at that point, modifying frequency is probably going to have a big effect. And so I think for untrained or generally undertrained individuals, that sort of fatigue shows up earlier in a session. And so if you actually meted or spread the training out over more days, then perhaps the training load will go up, which again, it's the same relationship, just a kind of like wrinkle in how that's being explained there. All right, so that was the first signal that popped up. And again, not menopause specific, but more just like training for all individuals. The second one is also not menopause specific, but they did find it. It's insulin sensitivity. For every 1 unit increase in a test that's called a HOMA-IR, that's an acronym, and it's a measure of insulin resistance, it was associated with a roughly 40% higher odds of non-response to training. Now, HOMA-IR is a number you can pull from a fasting glucose and insulin test, and it indexes how insulin resistant someone is. So a healthy and normally insulin sensitive person sits around 1 or so. 2 is borderline. 3 we consider real insulin resistance. So the gap between a 1 and a 3 in HOMA-IR on these data in this data set is like a doubled risk of not responding to a real training program. But this is where that cardiometabolic story from episode 2 connects directly with training. The pathway that insulin resistance blunts is the same pathway resistance training works through. Insulin-resistant muscle has a dampened anabolic response to a given training stimulus, and this is true across populations. It shows up in trials of older adults, in people with type 2 diabetes, in people with obesity. It's not just menopause-specific. Training improves all of these things nonetheless, but to me, this finding in postmenopausal women is one slice of a much larger pattern. So that's the training side. Nutrition's the other half, and it follows the same pattern. Most of what's being sold as menopause specific is smoke and mirrors. There's a 2026 review aimed directly at this. A group pulled together 34 strength training studies done specifically in postmenopausal women, about 1,500 women, and asked one thing. Once she's already lifting, does adding some specific diet or supplement do anything on top of that? The training itself reliably improved muscle, strength, and bone. It's a sledgehammer. Then they looked at protein in 9 of those studies. Above a pretty low floor, eating more protein added nothing to strength or muscle mass. So that message you've heard that you suddenly need a gram per pound the moment you hit menopause doesn't seem to be supported by evidence. Now, of course, you can. It's not dangerous, and we still want you hitting enough, somewhere around 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day, but chasing huge protein numbers isn't really necessary. Now, the one dietary change that clearly did do something was a modest calorie deficit. A few hundred calories a day under maintenance, and all that did was help with weight loss, specifically fat loss, which is exactly what you'd predict. It has nothing to do with menopause. Creatine, calcium, vitamin D, branched chain amino acids, omega-3s, and the herbal stuff, the evidence that it adds anything on top of the training was thin to non-existent, which is kind of the whole point. The training, again, it's the sledgehammer. It's the most important piece. The nutrition supports it. It doesn't replace it. And almost none of it needs to be menopause specific. Most of it, what's being sold as menopause specific is just marketing hype. There's a lot of talk about protein intake, particularly in this population, from some very popular and loud people saying you gotta eat, a gram per pound of body weight of protein per day. Suggesting that women in this phase in life need more protein, which is not evidence-based. And in fact, our recommendation would be if you're going to have a protein target, 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day is fine. If you wanted to lower that to 1.2, we'd probably also be okay with that. Because again, increasing protein in the absence of resistance training is going to have a very limited, if any, effect. The best effect, if I was being super charitable to this claim about increasing dietary protein, it's that when people do that, they tend to pick minimally processed or unprocessed sources for this protein, and it can displace other foods that we wouldn't necessarily want the person consuming a lot of. That said, just the increase in protein, if that's the only thing that changed, the dietary quality didn't change or whatever, you and I would both predict almost no real appreciable change here. But if you wanted a protein target, it is no different in the perimenopausal state, postmenopausal, premenopausal, any other stage in life. All right. So 3 to 4 meals per day with roughly 30 grams of protein, whether it's from whey, dairy, eggs, lean meat, fish, soy, legumes, whatever, that's all going to work. But there's no menopausal specific protein intake. And if you want to go higher than that, we don't think that it's risky. It's just mostly costly. Like it's just going to cost you more. And, to the extent that you love a high protein diet, that's great, but it doesn't need to be any higher than that unless you really want to. And then I have questions on why do you really want to? If it's a palate thing or it's because you've been conditioned to believe that it's better. Anyway.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. That reflects my usual recommendations in this conversation. A lot of folks, especially those who are, I'm seeing a lot of folks who are using GLP-1s for, weight management, especially in this phase of life. That's probably the majority of patients that I see are peri and postmenopausal women in this stage of life who are interested in using GLP-1s. And so pushing to very, very, very high protein intakes can become actually quite a challenge for some folks, depending on their degree of appetite suppression. And so if I can get them over consistently 1.2 grams per kilo per day, I'm actually quite content with that. And then I'm putting way more emphasis on, are we getting enough muscle stimulus? Are we getting training done? And if they're like, look, I cannot even manage to get my protein intake to that level, I'm assessing is our dose a bit too high? Do we need to back off on the dose, or are we over suppressing this person's appetite? But if not, and they're still maybe closer to 1 or 1.1, but they're training plenty, I'm like, you're probably still actually in a really good spot.
Yeah. It's just going to take a lot for me to want to recommend higher, and recommending higher than 1.6 is more like an experiment. It's yeah. Sure, the point estimates in the data suggest maybe up to 2.2 grams and maybe you respond a little bit better, but at that point it's incremental. It's not like this is going to change your life.
Yep.
The second thing that gets thrown around a lot with respect to diet is creatine. Creatine had a resurgence. I think in the 90s and early 2000s, creatine was what is this new thing? And then it kind of went away. Everyone just accepted that creatine is the most well-studied dietary supplement. And, there wasn't a lot of hype around it. But now it's back for whatever reason. And ironically, it's getting advertised to menopausal women like it has this unique benefit. I just saw this on Threads and I got into it with this particular individual because they said it has the biggest effects in any population in postmenopausal women. And I was like, citation, desperately.
Show me. I would love to see that. Yeah.
There are studies here. So for example, there's a meta-analysis by Dos Santos. 10 randomized controlled trials in older female participants found small to moderate strength benefits, larger in trials that are lasting over 24 weeks. This is the same as we see outside of menopause. A modest effect on strength. No loading phases needed. You can just do 3 to 5 grams of creatine per day, or if you want to do body weight based dosing, it's 0.03 to 0.05 grams of creatine per kilogram body weight per day. But with the loading phase, this is where most of this bloating claim comes from, particularly in women. So during these loading phases, people are taking 20 grams of creatine per day. Now, interestingly, those bloating observations came from studies in men. So it is interesting that this is kind of translated over to creatine causes bloating in women. Existing data shows that creatine does not increase total body water unless somebody's doing a loading phase. And so, Dr. Baraki, because you love bean physiology, aka renal physiology, kidney physiology, if total body weight total body water doesn't go up, right? And there's not a massive reallocation of where that water is stored in the body. How is it possible that creatine would cause bloating in an individual?
Yeah, it does not strike me as a fluid or a hydration mediated phenomenon. It might be primarily gastrointestinal in some way, but much more likely if the total body water assessment, because the body, we don't need to get into my nephrology chalk talk of the body compartments and the extracellular, intracellular, interstitial fluid compartments and things like that. But overall, it is more likely to be some form of a subjective sensation that may be mediated from within the gastrointestinal lumen than it is from the interstitial tissues, or certainly the extracellular fluid compartment, which would be the main one that people would quote unquote notice. You're not likely to notice anything in terms of intracellular fluid compartment, which is actually the bigger one between the two. But anyway, we don't need to get into that.
Yeah, the loading phase does seem to draw a bunch of water into the gut, which is why we think people get those sort of gastrointestinal related symptoms, whether it's upset stomach, whether it's the feeling of being bloated or whatever, but not in regular dosing, 3 to 5 grams per day. And people are like, well, you got to drink more water because it's going to dehydrate you. It's well, if total body water doesn't change, right, and the amount of water that goes into the muscle, so intracellular water, it's a very small, imperceptible change. Then again, explain to me how it increases rate of dehydration. And in fact, when it's actually been studied, decreases symptoms of dehydration, or what people classically associate with that, which would be cramps. For example, there's studies in kidney patients on dialysis, and there's studies in D1 football players showing decreased incidence of cramps with creatine. In any case, creatine's fine if you want to use it and you're a perimenopausal woman, but not life-changing, just like it's not life-changing for anyone else. You don't need a different dose. You don't need a pink one. You don't need a specific brand. We would just advise, if you're going to use dietary supplements, that they're third-party tested, should be stamped somewhere on the label so you know that it's not contaminated with something else that could potentially cause some harm. Another two items here related to the diet that are commonly sort of discussed with respect to perimenopausal women, vitamin D. I don't know that it's uniquely discussed on the internet, because it seems like everybody needs vitamin D. But in clinical cases, yeah, vitamin D comes up quite a bit, mainly with respect to bone health. Now, this is controversial. Both of us would admit that. When do people need to be supplementing vitamin D? When should you be testing for vitamin D? So get your take on this quickly. But my thought here is that if somebody has frank vitamin D deficiency, they're below 30 nanomoles per liter, below 20 certainly, a vitamin D supplement is reasonable to replenish vitamin D. I'm not sure that's going to do much, but I do feel better about buffing the chart in that case. But if somebody has a range between 30 and 50 or whatever, I'm less certain that it's going to do anything. And in fact, I'd be more curious, why is their vitamin D level low in the first place? Whether that leads me on a chase to suss that out, I don't know. How do you think about vitamin D in this particular population?
Yeah, I think that your lower cutoff of 20 is definitely the threshold that would get more of my attention. I think we have stronger evidence to get people above that level if they are below it. The 30 you'll see also used as a cutoff in a lot of places. I think that the evidence for that cutoff is quite a bit weaker. And certainly, there are some folks out there who are saying like, you need to get it up to like 75 or 90 or something like that. And there's literally like no compelling evidence that will dramatically improve outcomes for somebody, definitely for like who's already vitamin D sufficient, So like going from like 50 to 80 or something like that, compared with going from 10 to, 35, the latter I would be much more in favor of. The former I'm much less in favor of, or more indifferent to, I would say. And so, this population, the main consideration here is mostly relating to their bone health. And so there are some implications for that, because there are well-established direct implications of estrogen withdrawal on bone health at any stage of life. And so that's where this becomes most important. All of the other purported effects of vitamin D, again, I'm open to being convinced if somebody can show, a well done, clinical trial of taking people with an issue who are also insufficient, randomizing them, restoring levels, and seeing a clinically meaningful impact on outcomes. That's kind of the thing that you don't see from a lot of people out there who hype up vitamin D a lot, or, who are involved in this conversation, is just like, here's the type of evidence that I'm looking for that would like lead me to change my recommendation. In other words, I'm like pre-registering my belief change criteria. Show me that, and then I'm like happy to change that advice. But until then, I'm like kind of more of a shrug outside of those like true frank deficiency ranges, which is at least 20, and then a much softer case for getting over 30.
Yep. The next one is supplemental calcium. It does have a possible cardiovascular safety signal in postmenopausal women specifically. So if there's anything in this conversation so far that's postmenopausal specific, outside of like maybe fear mongering or sort of the need for some sort of special approach, this could be it so far. There's a Kim meta-analysis that found a roughly 15% higher cardiovascular disease risk in postmenopausal women who were taking supplemental calcium, with the signal concentrated in coronary heart disease specifically. This is contested and is controversial, but it was reported in this meta-analysis. I don't know how this squares with any of your recommendations regarding supplemental calcium with respect to like bone mineral density in this kind of vulnerable population. Is this something you take into consideration, or how does that go?
Yeah, it's super individualized. I'm taking usually going to be more of a dietary history on somebody to get a sense of like ballpark how much there are. There are these tools out there like dietary calcium intake calculators, where you can just roughly put in like how many servings of a given set of common food items, and it'll spit out an estimate for you of what the habitual daily calcium intake is. There are also other situations where calcium, taking some form of supplemental calcium may be particularly beneficial. Those are going to be much more individualized, related to malabsorptive disease states and things like that. So getting a bit beyond beyond our scope here. So ultimately, this is just going to end up being a very individualized recommendation. I don't routinely say that like every person in this particular demographic or above this age range or postmenopausal should be taking a calcium supplement, because I don't have good evidence to support that.
Yeah. So that's the story when it comes to exercise prescription and some sort of dietary nuance. It's pretty much the same prescription we'd give any healthy adult, with maybe a handful of specifics that need to be discussed more for postmenopausal women due to what's been said to them previously. Now, one of these specifics deserves further discussion, in my opinion, because it is the mechanism, it's the story that the menopause supplement market leans on the hardest. And this has to do with anabolic resistance. Now, the popular framing here is that menopausal and postmenopausal women have anabolic resistance, that their muscles less responsive to the protein and the exercise stimulus that worked at age 30. And that is the reason that they need a specialized supplement and protocol stack. Like a lot of other of these popular narratives, it's partially true in some cases, but mostly overstated. So this anabolic resistance idea comes from a specific kind of study. Researchers will feed someone a measured dose of protein and then directly measure how much new muscle protein the body builds in response over the next few hours. It's called muscle protein synthesis, that they're kind of trying to measure that response. Now, in young adults, around 20 grams of high-quality protein at a meal maxes out that muscle protein synthesis response. In older adults, you need more, somewhere in the 25 to 40 gram range to get the same response. So the per meal requirements for protein appear to shift upwards with age, and that gap is what anabolic resistance describes. You just respond less robustly to dietary protein and subsequently to exercise as well. The gap, however, appears to be in those who are inactive, particularly older adults with metabolic disease or people who are immobilized, like on bed rest or are hospitalized for some reason. It is small or absent in older adults who are active, especially if they're lifting weights. Even a short bout of activity effectively eliminates it, like a 10-minute walk before a meal, all right? A few weeks of actually exercising, lifting weights in particular, improves it even further. So being active, relatively healthy, and being non-sedentary do most of the work here. Importantly, though, this is not a menopausal finding. The literature on anabolic resistance is largely in older adults of both sexes and mostly clinical populations, people in a hospital. The largest study to date on basal muscle protein synthesis, 215 healthy, non-obese adults across a wide variety of ages, found no difference between young and old and no difference between men and women in muscle protein synthesis. They had the same baseline anabolic machinery regardless of age or sex. Now, these people were generally healthy, right? They were not in a hospital. They were not on bed rest, right? So they were somewhat active at least, and they didn't have any of this metabolic disease, which was, we think is a big factor here. The Isenmann trial that we walked through earlier showed that postmenopausal women added measurable muscle thickness, measured by direct ultrasound, after a standard barbell training program, which is not what an anabolically resistant population would look like. And the meta-analytic data on sex differences in training response in older adults find similar relative gains in men and women. And so the literature where anabolic resistance shows up most clearly is in sedentary older adults, usually those with metabolic disease, and particularly those on bed rest or who are mobilized in a hospital, none of which is a description of healthy, active, postmenopausal women. The menopause fitness market still leans on this, and they've taken this sort of finding in the literature and marketed it to you. So the prescription, to my mind, is the same. Lift, do enough conditioning, eat enough protein, but you don't need to micromanage it, and manage any of the medical conditions that you may have. You can skip the leucine pills. Anybody can do that. Skip the HMB. Anybody should do that. And the specialized menopause protein powders and supplements that you're paying a pink tax on anyway. All right, so Austin, a patient walks in with a supplement stack and a question. 48 years old, she's perimenopausal, she's got hot flashes, her sleep is bad, and she's been listening to a menopause coach. She's on creatine, magnesium, ashwagandha for cortisol, a phytoestrogen blend, collagen marketed as menopause-specific protein. She's even taken evening primrose oil in addition to vitamin D and a separate adrenal support blend. She wants to know whether to add MHT on top because of anabolic resistance and whether her current stack is doing what the coach said it would. How does that conversation go?
It's like you have been sitting on my shoulder for so many conversations that I have had with patients. So separate, I would say that most often they're not necessarily coming in specifically with concerns about anabolic resistance, but rather the nature of their symptoms and lots of other concerns. But this backstory of the symptomatic presentation, the substantial supplement stack is one that I see actually quite often. The first thing is just listening to what their experience is like. What have they been through from the beginning? What led them to start pursuing, this coaching and these supplements? And what have they felt has been the impact of those things? Because I think the wrong way to go about this conversation is just to immediately be like dismissive right off the bat of like everything that they're doing or everything they've done. Because maybe it's actually very likely that they have a much better rapport with their existing coach compared with you. And you have to build that up front. And so getting a sense of the symptoms, the severity, the path that led them to each of these supplements and whether they feel like they're helping. Because along the way, it's possible that you can validate the things that are helping them, which can also go a long way to build some rapport. So if they want to take creatine, that's fine. If they want to take vitamin D, that's fine. The magnesium also gets a shrug from me. Some people anecdotally say it helps them with all sorts of things. And as long as your, renal function is okay, it's very unlikely to cause harm. Worst case scenario, it can have a little bit of a laxative effect for you. So, go for it. That's all good. The remaining things are where I'm going to probably set up a little bit more pushback, right? So the idea that you need to be on something like for cortisol, explain, the thought process, what we're trying to treat, what the issues are there. The phytoestrogen blend, I'm also not likely to be in favor of because, hey, this person's still having hot flashes and, presumably some night sweats and things like that. And it's like, well, if that's what estrogen helps with, and if that was doing its job, your symptoms would have dropped precipitously. And I can just give you real estrogen and help with those things. And the idea that there's a menopause-specific protein is, between you and I, total nonsense. But the way I'm going to discuss that might be a little bit different. And then, so that's kind of how I'm going to go about this conversation. And then I would probably frame the conversation about the consideration of use for menopausal hormone therapy, not so much directly to quote unquote treat anabolic resistance, because if she is already, otherwise like pretty healthy, and especially if she's very active, she is unlikely to have any meaningful anabolic resistance outside of being on, high dose glucocorticoids or being very sedentary, being super inflammatory state from an untreated autoimmune condition. Like those are the kind of things that can contribute to anabolic resistance. We know that even among older adults or even middle-aged adults who remain highly physically active, they can retain much of the anabolic sensitivity of their younger years. But that doesn't mean to say that this patient might not benefit from menopausal hormone therapy, but it might be that, hey, if we use an effective formulation dose route of menopausal hormone therapy, maybe we mitigate your hot flashes, your night sweats, you sleep better, you recover better, you can train harder, and then you get even better results from your training program, right? And so trying to identify like what are the primary issues that this person is experiencing and what options do I have to manage those safely and effectively, rather than trying to treat a much more of a theoretical phenomenon that's unlikely to even be happening with this patient. So ultimately listening, validating, trying to, encourage or be validating of using the things that are either working or are like fine to take, trying to trim away the things that are unlikely to be helping or may even be harmful, and then use a more effective method of menopausal hormone therapy to treat the debilitating symptoms if that's what she's interested in. But not so much to say this is how we treat anabolic resistance, because if it's framed that way, then you may as well be like, well, why aren't you just going on anabolic steroids? Because that would be a great way to treat anabolic resistance.
Oof. Yeah. Should we do a hot take on whether or not you think MHT should be allowed in sport, or we'll save that?
Yeah, no issues from my standpoint, but yeah,
All
we
right.
can come back. That'd be an interesting question.
Yeah. All right. So that is this story with, oh my God, what were we just talking about? Oh yeah. That is the story with anabolic resistance. Now the next question is what people with the loudest voices and the largest audience in the space are actually saying and where it lines up with the data and where it doesn't. We'll get to that right after the break. This podcast is sponsored by Factor. Between finishing our new book, Signal, work, and training, my schedule right now is not exactly relaxed. And when I get home late, cooking is just not happening. Relying on willpower is a problem that even I run into, but staying prepared with Factor is how I've been solving it. Now, Factor offers fully prepared meals designed by dietitians and put together by chefs. They're fresh, they're never frozen, and they're ready in 2 minutes. I've been leaning on the Muscle Pro collection because the protein is there and the macros fit my current energy needs. But they have over 100 rotating options, whether your goal is weight loss, whether it's health, GLP-1 support, and more. I love having this as an option to keep me on track, and if you can relate, it may be a great option for you too. Head over to factormeals.com/BBM50off and use code BBM50off to get 50% off and a free daily greens box, if that's something you're into. New subscriptions only. This is while supplies last through September 27th, 2026. See the website for details. That's factormeals.com/BBM50off. This podcast is sponsored by Figs. Now, if you work in healthcare, you already know that the standard issued hospital scrubs are mostly an afterthought. They don't fit well, they're scratchy, and they're perpetually on the verge of falling apart, which can lead to some embarrassing moments in the parking lot when you get out of your car and you're the fresh intern on the block. Not that I'm speaking from experience or anything. Figs designed their scrubs around what we actually do. They're lightweight, they're tailored so they fit like real clothes, and they're built to handle the kind of laundry abuse that comes with the job. They're also antimicrobial, which, given what we're walking around in all day, it's not a small thing. And it's not just scrubs. They've got a New Balance collab for footwear, compression socks for those long shifts, and outerwear for when the hospital administration decides that the entire building needs to be kept at 58 degrees. If I was still in the hospital, I would definitely wear these at work. And now Figs is offering 15% off your first purchase. Head to wearfigs.com and use code FIGSRX at checkout to get 15% off. That's wearfigs.com, code FIGSRX for 15% off. We talk a lot about training and nutrition on this show, but sleep is probably the variable that most people are underinvesting in. And the data on temperature and sleep quality is pretty compelling. If your sleep environment is too warm, you tend to stay in lighter sleep stages and miss out on the deeper sleep that your recovery actually needs. ChiliPad 2.0 by SleepMe is a water-based mattress topper that lets you set your bed temperature anywhere from 55 to 115 degrees. It sits on top of your existing mattress, and the new version has a quieter dock, a larger water tank, and a nightstand remote for each side of the bed that detects when you get in and starts your sleep schedule automatically. If you share your bed, dual zones let each of you set your own temperature. No subscriptions, you buy it, you own it, and there's a 2-year warranty, and it's designed and assembled right here in the USA. Visit sleep.me/BBM to get up to $255 off your ChiliPad 2.0 with code BBM. You get free shipping, there's a 30-day sleep trial, free returns if it's not for you. That's sleep.me/BBM for up to $255 off your ChiliPad 2.0. Summer's almost here, and that means once again, my wardrobe has to change. I want pieces that feel lighter and more breathable, things that are easy but still look put together. And that's why I keep coming back to Quince. They focus on high-quality essentials that feel and look great, breathable linen, soft organic cotton. These are well-made basics without the luxury markup. Their European linen pants and shirts are the perfect warm weather upgrade, starting at just $34. The t-shirts are soft and easy to wear, and their lightweight cotton sweaters are great for the cooler summer nights here in San Diego. And the best part, everything is priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands because Quince works directly with ethical factories and cuts out the middlemen. You're paying for the quality, not brand markup. And Quince goes way beyond just clothing. They've got custom furniture, ceramic cookware, premium bedding. It's the kind of brand you end up recommending to everyone for almost everything. So far, I've been really happy with all of the clothing that I've picked up from Quince. It looks great and it doesn't break the bank. That's Quince in a nutshell. Elevate your summer wardrobe. Go to quince.com/BBM for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/BBM for free shipping 365-day returns. Quince.com/BBM. One of the questions we get asked all the time is, what books do you recommend for people who are interested in coaching others or who are taking their training very seriously? And it just so happens that a friend of the show, Dr. Eric Helms, along with Andy Morgan and Andrea Valdez, just released the 3rd edition of the Muscle and Strength Pyramid books. Now, if you're not familiar, these cover the full hierarchy of what actually matters for nutrition and training, organized by priority, so you spend your time on the things that actually move the needle, and you get all of the science behind it too. Over 200,000 copies of the book have sold at this point, and for good reason. I read it, and it is excellent. So if you're looking for a great resource to have alongside our book, Signal, and you want to go deeper on programming and nutrition planning, this would be a great addition to your library. Right now, you can go to muscleandstrengthpyramids.com/BM10 and use code BM10 for 10% off. That's muscleandstrengthpyramids.com/BM10. Code BM10 gets you 10% off at checkout. All right, we're back here on the Barbell Medicine Podcast. Now, every generation of women has been told a different wrong thing about exercise. In the 1890s, the dominant medical advice for middle-class women was the rest cure, prescribed for the diagnosis of neurasthenia. Don't exert yourself. Lie in a dark room. Chill out. In the 1960s, women were told not to run long distances, that it would damage their reproductive organs. The first women's Olympic marathon was 1984. Until 1994, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists told pregnant women to keep their heart rate under 140 beats per minute, a recommendation that was based on vibes and was quietly withdrawn for that reason. Now, each one of these was the loud, confident cultural message of this decade. Each was wrong, and the women who absorbed each one of them paid for it in lost training years. The menopause fitness market is that current installment. Now, to be fair, the loudest voices in the space are mostly telling women to lift, to eat protein, train for their bone health, and to stop being afraid of lifting heavy, which is directionally correct. But the same voices are also overstating effect sizes, claiming a menopausal exceptionalism that the data does not support, demonizing aerobic exercise, and selling proprietary supplements and protocol stacks that the literature doesn't back. We're going to walk through a few specific claims to push back on the claims, not necessarily the people, although some shade intended. So claim number 1, lift heavy or you're going to lose your bones. The version of this in circulation is often associated with Stacey Sims, and it's that women must lift heavy or they're going to lose their bones, that intensities below 85% of your 1 rep max is essentially useless for bone, and that the period of perimenopause is a closing window after which bone is lost. Okay, this one I actually half agree with, so let me give it its due. Bone responds to loading. You load it heavier, you get a bigger response. That's real, and perimenopause does kick off a stretch where you lose bone faster. Also real. And for years, women got told to keep it light, go easy, protect yourself, which honestly just left them weaker and with less bone than if somebody handed them a real weight training program. So when this crowd says, lift heavy for your bones, they're pointed the right way for the first time in a long time. Now, where it falls apart is how hard the claim gets. It usually turns into 2 things. That anything under about 85% of your max, anything light, does basically nothing for bone. I can think of another fitness organization that says the same thing, but for strength. And that there's a window. If you didn't catch it, you blew it, you're done. And neither of those is true. Here's the part that trips people up. If you just look at all of the bone studies lumped together, the results are kind of meh. And the lift heavy people love to point at that. But the reason that they're meh is because most of these studies never loaded anybody hard. It's machines, bands, little pink dumbbells. So you're really just measuring what easy training does to bone, which is, not much. But heavy doesn't necessarily mean grinding out max 1 rep efforts that, maybe scare some people away from going to the gym in the first place. When you actually pull the studies where women lifted heavy, the results on bone show up somewhere around 65 to 85% of your max a couple days a week. Now that's legit lifting. It's not bands, it's not body weight stuff, but it's also not necessarily the 1 rep max or max effort stuff that is being sold in the space. Bone responds across a large range, just like strength, just like muscular hypertrophy, just like cardiorespiratory fitness when it comes to conditioning. Basically just has to be heavy enough. So lift and lift like you mean it, yes. But the idea that there's one tiny window and that you're locked out for life if you miss it, you're basically never locked out, which again is the whole point of this episode. It's never too late. So genuinely moderate loading, 65 to 85% of 1 rep max works. Heavy loading above that works maybe a little bit more, but the bone responds across the range once it's heavy enough. Austin, any thoughts on this loading specifics and maybe where that goes awry here?
Yeah, I think it's useful to recognize that much like we've talked about with muscle and strength adaptations before, that the range of loads that can lead to meaningful responses is wider than was previously thought. That's fundamentally a good thing, right? For a lot of reasons, because it makes accessible and it makes this type of training more accessible to more people. Because otherwise, you're telling people the only way is to lift 90% of 1 rep max or heavier. Right. And some people are going to be mortified to do something like that, especially if they've already been diagnosed with some issue related to bone mass, depending on how it's been explained or delivered to them. They're going to be like, there's no way, I'm going to risk a fracture which is to be clear, not accurate. But that's a lot of common fears that are around loading, especially in the context of bony related issues, be it osteoarthritis or osteoporosis or osteopenia or any of these things. So really, we're just like broadening the range of effective options that we can use with patients. And it might be that you start out with somebody who is willing to start out at, say, like 60-ish%, and maybe they get bitten by the bug, and over time they want to progress up to those higher levels. That's great. That's a win, right? And I don't even think that Stacey Sims would disagree with that idea, but she might say that, hey, the 60% is like worthless, and it's not until you get up to those higher levels that it's effective, which again, we would kind of take some issue with. So I think that broadening the set of available options that can deliver efficacy here is fundamentally a good thing. That's the first thing I would say. The second is, I have historically kind of pushed back against a like super, super myopic focus on the BMD, mineral density measurement. So like just the T-score alone. I've had these conversations with so many patients over the years who get very fixated on the T-score and its trajectory, not even accounting for like error bars in measurement from test to test, but also recognizing that, you cannot feel your bone density. Having a T-score of a given value does not impact your day-to-day life or your quality of life outside of your risk of fracture, right? That's the main thing that we care about here. And so viewing bone density, bone health, osteopenia, osteoporosis purely through the lens of a T-score is, again, super myopic. And I try to broaden the perspective here and to say the number one, the most common reason why we start to see not just fractures, but major osteoporotic fractures, and then the really bad outcomes that people have heard about. Because a lot of people have heard like, oh yeah, the super high mortality risk in the 1 year after a hip fracture and things like that. It's like those people most often are like pretty frail, often multi-morbid, a lot of medical conditions, historically quite sedentary. And it was because they fell. Overwhelmingly, it's because they fell. And so there's a lot of productive training and activity that we can do that is not necessarily 90% of your 1 rep max that can go a long way to mitigate your risk of falling and make you more robust in general. Even some like just general athletic activities, maybe some power, some speed, some bounding, some agility, something like that. All of the things that go to mitigate your fall risk, I'm like hugely in favor of. And then also the loading as a supportive role. And fortunately, again, the loading ranges that are useful, much broader than you might traditionally think. And then if it's appropriately progressed over time, you're good.
All right, I'm going to give you a would you rather, and we're not going to belabor this point because we do have more to go.
Okay.
Would you rather? You have a person who does almost exclusively machine-based training, right? And their bone mineral density improved by 8%, right? Versus a person who does almost exclusively free weight, freestanding barbell training, but their bone mineral density only improved by 4%, mainly due to like loading restrictions, we'll say, right? If we assume that the person doing free weights has like better coordination, kinesthetic awareness, perhaps less of a fall risk, and that does turn to play out. Which scenario are you picking?
Yeah, I think under that assumption, I'm picking the latter.
Yeah, that is an assumption though. But yeah, that is my kind of thing when people are like, what do you pick, free weights versus, machines? Like, why would you do that? I'm like, I do think there's something with the coordination and, ability to prevent falls. There's something there. I can't prove it to you, right? To the extent this has been investigated, it's insufficient, but that's kind of my vibes based thing. So even people who are kind of averse to training, particularly heavily or unable to do so for whatever reason under like heavy barbell training, heavy free weight training, I do still want them to do some free weight movements, whether it's just body weight squats, lunges, a step up, something like that for like a coordination game to the extent that that's the thing we can train. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, all totally. Right. And similarly, I would take somebody with a bit lower bone density, maybe even in the osteopenia range, but who is like super agile and athletic over somebody who, who has maybe even a slightly better bone density, but like doesn't do anything meaningfully like athletic or active or something.
Rocky
like
from Hail Mary. Okay.
Yeah, right.
All right. The next claim here is that cortisol is wrecking your training and stalling your fat loss. Now, this is the claim with the most legs in the menopause fitness market, or the menopause, as it were. It shows up in a few different flavors. Cardio raises your cortisol. That's why your weight's not moving. Fasting and dieting also raise your cortisol, which is why your weight's not moving. And your cortisol is high because perimenopause and adrenal stress. And until you fix the cortisol, nothing else will work. And the way to fix it is a boutique panel and a supplement protocol, of course. Stacey Sims pushes the cardio framing. You can't do zone 2, cortisol and such. You can't do too much high intensity stuff also because of cortisol and such. Mindy Pell's built an audience around cycle-synced fasting. And Sarah Gottfried and the broader functional medicine corner sells adrenal resets and cortisol rhythm panels. The list goes on. Now, all of these claims rest on the same confusion between two states of the cortisol system. The first one is this sort of transient elevation in response to exercise, calorie restriction, or psychological stress that lasts minutes to hours, then returns to baseline. The second is chronic hypercortisolism, Cushing's syndrome or Cushing's disease. That's a real disease that can have severe impacts on the body across every system that we care about. Data has been clear on this for a long time. We did a full episode on hypercortisolism earlier this year. It's linked in the show notes below. Now, mechanistically, we should say that estrogen, estradiol, does modestly blunt the HPA's reactivity. That is the sort of stress axis that does release cortisol. Loss of ovarian estradiol allows slightly larger stress-induced cortisol excursions in some women, particularly those with severe vasomotor symptoms and restricted sleep. While this is real, this effect is relatively small and not anywhere close to pathological hypercortisolism or Cushing's. Now, in exercise, cortisol goes up as a part of the sympathetic nervous system's fight or flight response. Its main role is to increase energy availability during exercise, right? Liberate your stored energy so you can use them. You need it. If you didn't have that, you'd be up a creek. In 2021, Dode and Montero did a meta-analysis looking at how high-intensity interval training affected cortisol across roughly 1,055 participants, including women. The pattern was the same across all of them. Cortisol does rise sharply when people do high-intensity interval training, but modestly during the session, again, to create the energy you need to do the exercise. 2 to 3 hours after the session, cortisol drops below where it started. By the next morning, it's back to baseline. The session is a temporary spike and a temporary dip on the either side of an unchanged baseline. The day-over-day total exposure to the cortisol doesn't go up. And the comparison that matters here is the comparison to Cushing's syndrome, which is what chronic pathological cortisol elevation actually looks like. Healthy adults run a resting cortisol level around 350 nanomoles per liter. Now, this does vary during the day, but that's just an average sort of resting level. A high-intensity interval training session might push that to around 600 or 700 for an hour or two before it falls back. Cushing's patients live above 900 continuously and never come back down. A temporary doubling of the baseline within normal range is not the disease state that wrecks muscle and bone and metabolism like Cushing's is. And again, this is high-intensity interval training specifically, the modality that the menopause fitness market often tells women to limit because of cortisol. Don't do the group classes, it's high intensity. Don't do sprints, it's high intensity. Your cortisol, it's going to go crazy. And that transfers over to the diet claim. The dieting cortisol claim is the same problem. A calorie deficit raises cortisol, which raises hunger and stalls fat loss. So you have to eat more to lose weight, which is in violation of thermodynamics and has never been shown in the literature to actually occur. The calorie trial, that's an acronym, CALERIE, is the strongest human randomized controlled trial we have addressing this. It's 220 adults, 30% were men, 70% were women. They were on a calorie deficit for 2 years. Yes, they lost a substantial amount of weight, okay? But there were no significant between group differences in cortisol at 24 months. It's not like, well, men were able to tolerate this and women weren't. The cortisol was fine. Now, that is different than severe energy deficiency, what we've called low energy availability. That's roughly like 30 kilocalories or calories per kilogram fat-free mass, or relative energy deficiency in sport, which is even maybe further complication of that. That's not what we're talking about. If the claim is that by going on a calorie deficit, most women are getting into low energy availability or REDS, I could be convinced to say that a calorie deficit is generally bad for cortisol. But Austin, have you seen any signal that that's the case? Are women with LEA, low energy availability, or REDS just turning up at clinics all over the world because they've gone on a calorie deficit?
Generally, they have a wide set of signs and symptoms from the low energy availability that are generally not attributable to the direct impact or are not mediated by impacts on cortisol in particular. And so in other words, when there is suspicion for that type of a condition or that type of physiologic state, the first thing we're doing is not, in fact, measuring, say, either 24-hour urine cortisols or doing dexamethasone suppression tests or something like that, because those are the types of things that we do to evaluate for clinical cortisol excess. The extreme, as you said, is Cushing's. There's a milder version that's becoming more and more well recognized now called MAX, or mild autonomous cortisol secretion. But what does it look like when somebody has like a mild amount of excess pathologic cortisol? Yeah, they tend to have high blood pressure. They tend to have a bit of insulin resistance, maybe some prediabetes, diabetes, things like that. And so that's something where you can do the test, do a dexamethasone suppression test, and they won't fully suppress to the degree that they should. And then you can go on and work it up from there. Maybe you find an adrenal adenoma or something like that and you address it. But the idea that, for example, I'll see a patient whose blood pressure is like 108/60, and we're talking about like chronic cortisol excess. And it's like,
you ain't got that.
Not really physiologically possible. It's not what I say in that encounter, but that's not really how that works. There are, certain signs that are quite sensitive for the likelihood of clinically significant or pathologic cortisol excess. And that's an example of one, right? And so not really the main focus here. I think it's nice and convenient to have a tidy narrative, a single like biological thing that you can point to and like demonize. And then you can contrast it like cortisol, enemy, do these things to make it go down. Estrogen, friend, everyone on earth should be on estrogen. And it's like this nice, neat, tidy narrative, or especially if you have a supplement that you can offer to like knock cortisol down, or a phytoestrogen supplement to bump up estrogen. It's a convenient sort of story that seems internally self-consistent. But as soon as it is tested a little bit more rigorously against like real human data in the real world, it tends to fall apart, because you can go to that very study that you described. And it's like, if it were true that the chronic calorie deficit would induce, pathological high, cortisol levels and all the downstream consequences, let me propose a clinical trial to you. Let's take some people and put them on a substantial calorie deficit for 2 years and watch. And this will be validated by their weight trajectory across that period of time, because that's how that would happen. What would you predict, based on your understanding of this physiology, is going to happen to cortisol at the end of the study? And their prediction would be, well, clearly people on a calorie deficit, they're going to have really high cortisol. Okay, well, here's the evidence. Now, what do we do with that information? What does that do to the confidence in your hypothesis? And if then suddenly the goalposts shift, then you're not really dealing with an honest broker, and the conversation's probably not worth having.
Yeah. I always wonder, if the claim that going on a calorie deficit increases cortisol to the level that compromises weight loss, right? If that's the crux of the claim, right? And then somehow it spins off to, well, the risk is really low energy availability where cortisol is going high. And I'm like, yeah. But the reason why we know that they're in low energy availability is because they lost all this weight. That's
right.
that's part of what's causing the symptoms also, okay? Yeah. It's not like they're just low on calories, but then subsequently like persisting at a particular body weight, which has never been shown. Mm-hmm. Never been shown. And this is the last thing I'm going to say about this, is this cortisol belly sort of narrative, that the midline fat redistribution women seen across the menopausal transition is somehow due to cortisol. Now, that can happen. Postmenopausal women do tend to carry more fat in the trunk than premenopausal women, even when total fat mass is the same. The mechanism is the loss of estrogen changing where the fat gets deposited, particularly when combined with muscle loss and if the energy balance is off, meaning that people are consuming more calories than they burn. This is uncontested. But if you call it cortisol belly, it names the wrong target, it's estrogen, and points at the wrong intervention. It's not lowering your cortisol by avoiding exercise or avoiding, dietary changes that would ultimately get your energy balance back in the right place. It's just the opposite, in fact. It's a grift. And I don't know what else to say about it other than it's wrong, and the people who are saying it are also wrong, and it makes me upset. Do you have any charitable take here? Because I don't have anything charitable to say.
My most charitable take is, if you are trying to attach like the biological word cortisol for a more generalized phenomenon of like, you can call it like stress belly. Okay, if you're trying to like use those words interchangeably in the sense that you have chronic stress, you're stressed about this life change transition, you have poor sleep that's impacting things. The poor sleep impacts your appetite. You end up inadvertently having a higher appetite during the day, calorie excess, you have poor sleep, you have lower energy, you exercise less. Like, there are a whole host of downstream consequences. And, we know that like chronic unmitigated, stress is not great for people's health in general. And I think it's a dramatic oversimplification to like linearize that through specifically just like cortisol signaling, right? Because if it were that simple, all we would need to do is just put you on like some dose of a glucocorticoid antagonist or a cortisol like blocking drug, which those do exist. They have almost no clinical utility in the majority of cases, but then it would be as simple as that. Just block the cortisol and then it goes down and then you're fixed. But that's really not what's involved here. So if nobody's doubting that there can be like a whole host of midlife stressors relating to your maybe your job and your family and your sleep and all sorts of other things that are impacted, and how that impacts your day-to-day activities and appetite and intake and activity and things like that, but not just as simple as a single blood biomarker.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you think about that phase of life, right? A woman in her late 40s, for example, and she has potentially has children that some responsibilities there, perhaps aging parents, some responsibilities there, job responsibilities there. Like, all of this is the perfect storm for activity to go down, for your dietary pattern to go a certain way, sleep to be compromised, all sorts of stuff. Now, this isn't a blame game. It's not a pointing at fingers. It's just that the behavioral changes are sort of predictable here, and then the sequelae to that are also predictable. And so, again, blaming cortisol and solving for cortisol does not fix any of those things. And so it's just a misappropriation of sort of effort, resources, and so on and so forth, which is why I get so heated about it. My cortisol is probably through the freaking roof right now. I need a cortisol blocker.
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, I can think of 2 conversations I've had in the past week with women in this demographic who were absolutely, I think it's an understatement even to say that they were at their just absolute wits end. One of them actually broke down on the call, like in tears while talking because of how terrible she was feeling and unable to like meet her day-to-day like needs because of how impaired her sleep was. And if I had said, oh, it's probably just your cortisol, we just need to like take this cortisol supplement, right? That would have been a terrible response in many, many ways, but much more so validating like the overall experience and how overwhelming it can be. And knowing both, I mean, not that we have been through that particular biological phenomenon, but also knowing what it feels like to be super strung out and underslept from going through like, residency did that to me for quite a while, substantial stretches. And then just like imagining what it's like to augment what I experienced in that stage with all the other demands that was on this person. And it's a much bigger and more complex problem and trying to find the levers that are actually worth attacking compared with making an oversimplified narrative like that.
Yep. Briefly, I just wanted to say that adrenal fatigue framing, it's the same sort of claim here, but it is not a recognized clinical diagnosis. The Endocrine Society's patient statement is explicit that no scientific proof exists to support that your adrenal glands that produce cortisol are fatigued, subsequently running out of cortisol. That would be a huge problem. Catiani and Cater in 2016 reviewed 58 studies on adrenal fatigue and concluded that the construct does not exist. The symptom complex it claims to describe maps onto depression, sleeping-related disorders, hypothyroidism, anemia, and perimenopause itself. The actionable consequence of the misdiagnosis is usually a stack of supplements and adaptogens, expensive testing, and the reframing of the normal perimenopausal symptoms as adrenal dysfunction. That doesn't mean that not any of the symptoms that people experience during perimenopause need to be, kind of hand-waved away or not managed. But the whole point is, if you call it a thing that it's not, then you're going to address it likely in an incorrect way. And that's what happens here. The Endocrine Society, to that point, also warns that adrenal supplements taken without need can suppress endogenous HPA function, so cortisol release, and produce iatrogenic adrenal insufficiency, low cortisol that can persist for months or longer after the supplements stop. In many ways, low cortisol is more risky than high cortisol, so getting the diagnosis right is important, and the wrong treatment can cause real harm. Now, Austin, I want you to consider a patient in her mid-40s. I think you've seen this before. She's anxious about her cortisol because a coach or a podcast told her it was the reason why her midsection hasn't budged. She's been avoiding cardio, avoiding fasted training, avoiding caffeine in the afternoon, taking ashwagandha at night, and she's considering a Dutch panel that her functional medicine doctor offered. None of it has changed her body composition to date, but what does the visit actually look like? How does that conversation go?
This is a long conversation. definitely a lot of listening, a lot of validating of the experience to date, but finding kind of what I'll call like entry points to gently start to push back against some of the stories that she's been told. Because if they were all true, if those stories were all true, then the things that she's been trying so far should have worked, right? And so that might be my initial entry point is like, if really those were all the keys to this, then maybe we would have expected, and maybe to see if that leads the person to be open to considering alternative approaches to the issue. I don't recommend essentially anything that she was doing except maybe avoiding caffeine in the afternoon if she finds that it's disruptive to her sleep, but avoiding conditioning, avoiding fasting training, using ashwagandha, Dutch testing, not something that I recommend for anyone. It's not a clinically validated or clinically useful test and don't recommend it. And so then I'm getting a sense, I'm trying to take like an inventory of what are the actual symptoms that this person is experiencing. Is it just the weight management? And I don't say just to minimize it, but meaning is it a weight management challenge in isolation, or are there other associated signs, symptoms, things that are bothering this woman that we ought to address? Are there, symptoms of persistent fatigue, excessive daytime sleepiness, other issues that she is experiencing in terms of appetite control, cravings, things like that, because that might impact my chosen treatment modalities. So there might be some testing that's indicated. Maybe this person would benefit from a sleep study. Maybe this person has iron deficiency that's underdiagnosed. Maybe if they have a set of, suggestive symptoms of the menopausal transition, maybe they would benefit from some form of hormone therapy, among many other things. And so I can offer potentially trading a variety of these ineffective things that she is, putting a lot of time and attention into doing perfectly or avoiding with no clear benefit with, hey, what if we took a pause on those things and just try the things that I'm suggesting for like a couple months? Because I would be much more confident that the treatments or the testing that I would have to offer would be much higher yield in a much shorter time frame compared with if she's been doing all of these things for a long time and not making progress. And then it becomes self-evident of like, yeah, maybe we're on a more of a correct track now compared with what we've been doing so far.
Yeah, that makes sense. So overall, cortisol is a real hormone. It's real. And frank disease states involved in it exist, but outside of those, measuring cortisol routinely in healthy women is not useful, and micromanaging it is not productive. The fragility framing around it can produce some real costs, particularly supplement dependency, avoidance of the modalities that women actually need, conditioning, exercise, sleep, for example, skepticism toward evidence-based interventions like MHT. The cortisol story to me is just a distraction from the stuff that actually works. All right. Next claim is that every symptom that a person is experiencing during menopause is hormonal, and HRT fixes all of it. The dominant version of this claim is associated with Mary Claire Haver, whose audience and book are organized around the idea that most midlife complaints in women are downstream of declining estrogen, and that hormone therapy is the underprescribed answer to most of them. Part of this is right and important, as we discussed in previous segments of this podcast series. Part of it is also overstated. As far as where the case is solid, MHT or menopausal hormonal therapy is effective and can do a lot of good for vasomotor symptoms, genitourinary issues, for reducing fracture risk, and so on, as we covered in our previous episodes in our menopause series. Many women who would clearly benefit from it are not being offered it. The louder voices in this corner have done useful work bringing the conversation to the forefront. But the claim that estrogen loss makes muscle building impossible without HRT is wrong. We talked about the 2021 DAM randomized controlled trial, postmenopausal women who had a transdermal estradiol patch versus placebo, both of them doing 12 weeks of resistance training. The placebo group gained almost 4% of muscle cross-sectional area in their quadriceps, whereas the group getting the estradiol patch made 8%. Estrogen made the training response bigger, but the training worked either way. It's the same thing that we see in men who have legitimate testosterone deficiency. Interestingly, our book on testosterone does not say that it's like a panacea for everything. Perhaps we would sell more copies if that were the case. There was also a Griesing meta-analysis that pooled 23 studies and roughly 9,000 women and found that the average strength advantage for menopausal hormonal therapy, MHT, was 5%. While this is also real, it's also modest and downstream of training. You're going to have to do the training regardless. There's other claims regarding exercise being a panacea. And look, we're the Barbell Medicine Podcast. We've been streaming about exercise for over a decade now. But saying that exercise treats hot flashes is also overstated. The North American Menopause Society 2023 non-hormone therapy position does not recommend exercise as primary treatment for vasomotor symptoms. And a 2022 systematic review found that exercise reduced hot flash severity slightly, but did not change how often they happen. Doesn't mean you shouldn't exercise if you're having hot flashes, but that it's a singular treatment for hot flashes, probably not the move here. And since it always comes up, we need to talk about testosterone supplementation in women. Yeah, taking exogenous testosterone. Now, the big meta-analysis here pooled 36 trials, over 8,000 women, and found no real benefit on body composition, on muscle, or on bone. A 2026 review lands in the exact same spot. The only thing that testosterone is actually approved for is a condition called hypoactive sexual desire disorder. It's basically just low sexual desire. Now, for muscle, bone, cognition, et cetera, the evidence is not really that clear. And it probably shouldn't be driving prescriptions for testosterone, though they have increased over the last decade or so. Now, where you do see a body composition effect from testosterone, it's dose dependent and pretty inconsistent. You only really get it by pushing testosterone levels above the normal female range. It's the same relationship we see in men. Now, at that point, you're not really treating anything specific. You're taking PED levels of anabolic steroids, which can come with the risk of side effects to match. All right, before we get into another clinical case for Dr. Baraki, one last claim. Menopause requires a fundamentally different programming paradigm. This is the sort of meta claim underneath all of the others. It powers the entire menopause-specific coaching certification market. The premise is that perimenopausal women need a proprietary protocol, a coach trained in female physiology, and a stack of products to make the training work. I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, but that's what it seems like from the outside. The biological case for specific programming, for special programming, usually rests on 3 points. 1, accelerated visceral fat accumulation across the menopausal transition. 2, accelerated loss of fat-free mass, specifically muscle. And then 3, reduced muscle protein synthesis sensitivity, right? So anabolic resistance. The SWAN cohort data quantified the first 2. Fat gain roughly doubles across the menopausal transition, about 1.5 kilograms over 3.5 years. And muscle loss averages around 0.2 of a kilo over that same period of time. That's 200 grams of muscle in 3.5 years. It's real for sure, but it's mostly confined to this transition and it's relatively small. All right. So Austin, this whole space is probably also a problem in your office because patients are arriving having spent time and money on protocols and products downstream of the claims we just walked through. But what does the conversation look like when the patient is already invested in one or more of these protocols?
I want to know what they're looking for from me first and foremost. Like, why'd they come and want to talk to me? Or do they have specific concerns that they were hoping I can help with? There are likely to be things about what they're doing that I would be happy to, cheerlead, to be in support of, to say, this is exactly what I would be suggesting or doing. There are probably also a fair amount of things that they might be doing that I think are unlikely to be helpful, but may not be harmful, in which case they've already paid for it. I'm like, kind of up to you. And then there may be a hopefully small subset of things where it's like, nah, this is actually actively a bad idea, or this is like risky or harmful. And those I would be happy to be, explicit, although, deliver it in a way that hopefully I have built the rapport that they can hear what I have to say about it. So really, it's just a matter of getting a sense of like, what have they already committed to? What are the things that are good? What are the things that are neutral? What are the things that are bad? And then what do they want from me? Do they want my advice? Do they just want, a hype man? Are they really looking to be like, look, which of these is actually worth my time and money? It's like, okay, let's dissect this. I'm ready to go on that conversation. So really just meeting the person where they're at and trying to get a sense of how I can best help them on that particular day. Yeah.
Yeah. That is some excellent sort of clinical experience being related here. So if you're in training, maybe go back, re-listen to that. Excellent. So that covers the broader market, the sort of, again, I don't want to just call it a pink tax on menopause-specific training, but it does seem like that. It's mostly women on women crime, and I'm getting sick of seeing it. So now we get into the one place that the literature has tightened most over the past 5 years and where the case for taking training seriously in this particular time of life is best made: bone density. One of the strongest cases for training in this population is to preserve bone health. Heavy loading works, it's safe, and the prior generation of clinical practice that told these women to avoid it was wrong. Belinda Beck's group out of Australia ran the LIFTMORE trial. It was published in the Journal of Bone and Mineral Research in 2018. 101 postmenopausal women, mean age was 65, all with T-scores below -1 at the lumbar spine or the femoral neck. Now, T-score is bone mineral density expressed as a standard deviation relative to a young adult reference. -1 is the threshold for osteopenia. -2.5 is osteoporosis. Many of these women had been told for years to avoid heavy lifting because of their bone mineral density. And in fact, when I posted a recapitulation of this study on our Facebook group, it's got over 1 million views now. So our first maybe viral post. People are saying, you can't have women with osteopenia or osteoporosis lift heavy because of a fracture risk. So this study, perhaps if they actually read the post or the study I linked, could have avoided that. But then I would have gotten viral. I don't know what to do. The intervention was supervised, high intensity resistance training and impact training. So twice a week, 30 minutes per session for 8 months. They did 5 sets of 5 repetitions above 85% of the 1 rep max on the deadlift, back squat, and overhead press. Plus they did jumping chin-ups with drop landings for the impact piece. They were just jumping down with straight legs. The control was a home-based low intensity program with bands and body weight. The lumbar spine bone density changed by 2.9%. It went up in the group lifting the heavy weights. It went down 1.2% in the control group. The femoral neck bone density was up by 0.3% in the group lifting heavy weights versus minus 1.9% in the group training at home. Both differences were statistically significant. Compliance was 92%, and there was only one minor adverse. It was a back spasm. Couple caveats here. One, were they lifting 85% of their actual 1 rep max? I assume they tested their 1 rep max on day 1, which also, interestingly, in this population, you imagine a bunch of women in their 60s and 70s maxing out on deadlift and having never trained before.
Hell yeah.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm cool with it, but like how many other people would be like, yeah, it's probably fine. Like I know that it's going to be fine or likely to be fine. So my thought is that they had a 1 rep max on day one, and then every time they lifted after that, it wasn't really 85% of their then 1 rep max because it actually got stronger. The intervention was supervised and progressed by a research team and group of experts. So not everyone has access to that. So there's some, something going on there. It was also only 8 months, not a lifetime. I still am waiting for like a lifetime study. That would be nice. To your point earlier, bone density is a surrogate endpoint, not a fracture outcome. So that's important to note. Now, the MedX OP follow-up trial compared high-intensity resistance training against Pilates and confirmed that high-intensity resistance training was again superior at the lumbar spine and did not worsen pelvic floor disability scores in women with osteopenia. More replications needed, but the heavy loading is too dangerous for osteoporosis era should be over. The mechanism is reasonably well understood. Bone is a living tissue. It's constantly being broken down, rebuilt, remodeled. The signal that tips that balance towards formation of new bone is mechanical strain, specifically the magnitude of that strain, the rate of the strain, and how unfamiliar the strain pattern is to the bone. So what we think is under heavy loading, the bone deforms at a microscopic level, and that sort of sends a signal to remodel, grow stronger, be more robust. Walking imposes a low magnitude of strain at a low rate. The bone barely notices it. A heavy deadlift or leg press or similar imposes much higher magnitude of strain through the spine and hip and is relatively novel. We walk everywhere. We don't deadlift everywhere. Present company obviously excluded. A jumping chin up with a drop landing imposes a similarly high rate of strain. The rate dependent piece, walking or Pilates apparently cannot produce. The two combined is what doing the work here in the LIFTMORE trial. And building bone in this window requires a specific kind of stimulus. Walking won't get you there. Yoga won't get you there. Pilates won't get you there. Supplements won't get you there. You have to load the bone in a way it's not used to being loaded. Now, Austin, the part of the LIFTMORE trial that people miss out on is who was in the trial. These were women, average age of 65 with osteopenia, half of whom would have been told by their doctor for a decade to avoid lifting heavy. What does your conversation with that patient look like?
Really assessing what their beliefs, their expectations, where they're kind of starting from in this conversation and where those things came from. Because as I've talked about before in the world of osteoporosis, historically, the way that this diagnosis is delivered and explained to people, much like when we talk about osteoarthritis being a quote unquote wear and tear problem, and that has certain built-in kind of implications for people in terms of like, well, then you tell them to exercise and like, isn't that more wear and tear? And it's like, well, it's more complicated than that. It's like, okay, maybe you should have bypassed that explanation up front. Osteoporosis, when it is delivered with a narrative of, oh, it means that you have brittle bones or fragile bones or weak bones. And so then you say, so go load it. And people are like, wait. And then you're like, well, it's more complicated than that. And it's like, okay, well, maybe your explanation was bad. And so this is where I keep coming back to the point that you made of bone being living tissue, right? I think that people don't intuitively understand that unless they have specifically, been taught that it is continuously recycling, alive, adapting either to the presence of load and stimulus, or it's adapting to unloading, the lack of loading by atrophying, not unlike our muscles. Muscle and bone trajectory tend to go along with one another across the lifespan in most people. So for a lot of people who have osteoporosis, a fair number of them will also be, heading towards a future of sarcopenia as well, if they're not already there. And fortunately, mechanical loading can ameliorate both of these problems when it is appropriately and sufficiently dosed, because all of these things are living tissues. So when we dose them appropriately with loading, give it the supporting environment of nutrition and sleep, then everyone who is alive and maintains a regular and perfusing rhythm can adapt to this type of loading. So that's the way the conversation goes, is like assessing what are they most worried about. Mm-hmm. Are those fears justified, valid? And it's not to say that, oh, well, that's not real. The first day you should go in and, go for your all out, bone on bone, quote unquote, 5 rep max or 1 rep max or something like that. But if you have that type of apprehension, totally fine to start lighter, but then emphasizing the role of progression being necessary, right? Just doing, I would prefer not to have this same conversation a year from now and find out that you went from like the light band to like the medium band. I'd rather find out that you went from maybe a moderate intensity load to a much higher load because you have in fact adapted and gotten stronger, indicative of your response to the training program.
Yeah. I just can't tell how much of this narrative, women don't lift heavy, like it's just been passed on for hundreds of years, if not even longer than that. In fact, some of this research I've been doing for the Lift for Your Life book or whatever, just historically, one notable group from history actually like advocated that women should train. Any guesses what that group is? Spartans.
The Spartans. I was that was like my actual only
so
guess.
So the Spartans, otherwise it was thought women shouldn't train or whatever. But in Sparta, they said, well, look, in order for us to produce strong stock,
sure,
well, women need to be strong too. And so they would train publicly, which is interesting. And then, in America, it wasn't until Bernard McFadden, he basically published the periodical called Physical Culture. He was the only one advocating for women to train in the 1890s, but everybody else was like, don't do it. Rest treatment. Anyway, one of the other reasons that heavy loading was historically avoided in this population is partly about fracture risk, which the LIFTMORE trial addressed. There were no fractures there, but it's also partly about the pelvic floor. And the concern was that heavy lifting could cause or worsen sort of pelvic floor dysfunction, urinary incontinence, or pelvic organ prolapse. The trial data here is pretty reassuring, however. A study from 2024 took 47 strength-trained women and had them do 4 sets of 4 reps at 75 to 85% of a 1 rep max on a back squat and deadlift in a randomized crossover against a comparator group who rested. Just rest. There were no differences in pelvic floor resting pressure, pelvic floor contraction strength, or pelvic floor endurance after the heavy lifting compared with the rest. So they would have served as their own control. So it's like, look, is it better at rest or is it worse when you're lifting? A separate trial by one of the same authors randomized inactive, overweight, and obese women to 12 weeks of strength training versus inactive control, so they didn't do anything, and found no difference in the new onset of urinary incontinence between the groups. Again, reassuring that starting a resistance training program, even if it's heavy, does not increase the risk of urinary incontinence. Cross-sectional studies in women who lift heavy do find high rates of pelvic floor symptoms, 30 to 40% in some samples. But those numbers get cited as evidence that lifting causes the problem, but this is an error. Pelvic floor symptoms are common in women, generally speaking, especially after childbirth, and the rates in lifters tend to track the rates in matched groups of non-lifters. The thing is, the women who aren't lifting weights, they have no real reason to have any sort of incontinence, meaning that there's nothing causing that issue to pop up in their day-to-day life. As far as treating women with established symptoms of stress urinary incontinence, pelvic floor muscle training does have some good evidence here. There's a 2018 Cochrane review of 31 trials and over 1,800 women that found that women with stress urinary incontinence were roughly 8 times more likely to report a cure with this sort of pelvic floor muscle training versus not. A study in 2024 in CrossFit women with stress urinary incontinence, 16 weeks of home-based pelvic floor muscle training produced symptom improvement in 64% of the intervention group versus 8% of the control group. Overall, this means that if a woman is lifting heavy and she's leaking, consider referral to pelvic floor PT. Transient leaking or heaviness during a set, it's not necessarily a reason to stop lifting. It's probably not going to make anything worse. But if you do have additional concerns, referral to an OBGYN would be reasonable to evaluate the patient for something that is concerning.
Yeah, this is an interesting take. I do not claim to be an expert in, these pelvic floor pathologies. My wife is a gynecologist and, sees a lot of these folks regularly and does, slings and all sorts of other procedures to help in those contexts. And the case that you made is kind of interesting, that it is very common in the general population, which does certainly seem to be true. Most of the patients that she operates on are not, coming seeking surgery or their mid-urethral sling procedure because of their lifting. Most of them are middle-aged and older women who are noticing symptoms or pelvic organ prolapse that they are predisposed to for other reasons, as you mentioned, things like childbirth. I was trying to think of what are some analogous cases in my world that I could think of. And one that came to mind is if you looked at what is the incidence of stable angina, like chest pain, among adults who are bedridden? It's none of them have it because they are not exerting themselves enough to manifest the symptom. Yet once you start to exert yourself, you're much more likely to, if you have underlying atherosclerotic, coronary disease, to exhibit symptoms of angina. And so this is the underlying problem is super, super common, right? A lot of people have coronary artery disease. Yet the people who are going to manifest with chest pain with exertion are those who are exerting themselves. And then the conclusion would be, well, you don't exert yourself. Otherwise, you're going to get yourself chest pain. Just lay in bed. When it's all these people laying in bed, they got it too. It's just not being unmasked or realized. It's kind of an interesting way to think about the problem.
Yeah. Upon doing some digging, I'm moderately confident that is the case until better data comes along and says, look, you took this large swath of people, started lifting, and versus didn't. And there's a huge difference in SUI rate, stress urinary incontinence, right?
That would have to also, scale. Yeah, you would also I as much as that question is one that's important to answer, it probably should still not be the only outcome that you look at, right?
100%.
Because you could say, well, yeah, maybe there's this difference in stress urinary incontinence, but then, for example, obviously it would be a difficult study to do, but like across the lifespan, what's the difference in osteoporotic fracture risk? Like that carries a risk of mortality. Whereas, some pelvic floor symptoms, not necessarily lethal, unpleasant, very, debilitating in their own way to quality of life. But there might be some just fundamental risk benefit trade-offs that some people are maybe more willing to make than others here.
Yeah. If the sort of main declarative symptom has no reason to show up, you can miss a lot. And I think that's what we see here.
Yeah.
All right, Austin, anything you want to add for the woman who's listening to this podcast, who's somewhere in this window, who's not started exercising yet and is feeling some combination of overwhelmed and maybe even a little behind?
I think the most optimistic case that we can make is one that we've been making for a long time. It's never, too late to start. Again, you are alive. That means that you can adapt. We just have to find the right entry point, the right dose, something that you can do, that you're willing to do. And if you feel overwhelmed doing it on your own, that's what we've been doing for a long time here. And so we would claim some degree of expertise in being able to guide people through this journey. So if you need help, feel free to reach out. Not only in the exercise front, can handle the menopause therapy, hormonal therapy conversations, all sorts of other things, but seek out some trusted guidance if you need it. But yeah, get started, and with proper dosing and progression, you can do a lot of good for your health and improve a lot of these outcomes over the long term.
Let me close the loop by knocking out the 3 fears that seem to keep women out of the gym. Fear 1, I've got osteopenia or osteoporosis or just low bone mass. Isn't lifting heavy gonna break me? The answer to this is no. Quite the opposite. The LIFTMORE trial took 101 women with an average age of 65, and every one of them had low bone density. A lot of them were told for years to avoid exactly this kind of training. And they had these subjects doing heavy deadlifts, squats, and presses. Their bone mineral density went up. Compliance was high at 92%, and the only injury in the whole study was one back spasm. Progressively loaded heavy lifting was apparently safe and effective in the exact population that many people say that it's dangerous for. Fear 2, I don't have the time. Now, time limitations are certainly real, but the good news is you probably need less exercise than you think to see a big return. 2 lifting sessions a week that are 30 to 45 minutes long, plus a little cardio covers most of the benefit. And the less time you have for cardio, the more you have to lean on intensity. Now, the menopause influencers would say that this is a bad idea because of cortisol, which is 100% false based on the available evidence. Fear 3, I leak when I lift, so I should stop. This is also not true. When researchers compared heavy lifting against just resting, the lifting didn't make pelvic floor strength or function any worse. Leaking, or stress urinary incontinence, is relatively common in women whether they lift or not. If it's happening to you, the move is a referral to a pelvic floor physical therapist, which has some pretty good evidence behind it. It's not quitting the thing that's protecting your bones and your future independence. And since we just spent an hour telling you who not to trust, let me give you the other side, how to actually pick a coach or clinician in this space. Some green flags. They'll ask you what you can do today and build from there using your preferences, resources, and so on, instead of handing you a pre-made program on day one. They'll talk about adding load over months, not about some magic exercise or magic supplement. They're comfortable saying, I don't know, or the evidence here is confusing or weak. And they treat training, sleep, and your actual medical care as the main event, with everything else as optional. Some red flags, well, they'll sell you a proprietary trademarked program that supposedly only works for menopausal women. They'll sell you a supplement stack sold right alongside the coaching. A menopause-specific certification is often worn as the main qualification, which honestly, if anything, just tells me that they bought into the exact marketing we spent this whole episode taking apart. Now, this isn't meant to throw shade at people seeking additional knowledge. We should be clear, there aren't really any menopause-specific considerations for exercise. The same level of individualization is useful for all folks, regardless of menopause status. And anybody promising that one thing, one hormone, one powder fixes everything, probably shouldn't be trusted. Real help is individualized. It's a little boring and honest about what it can't do. So let's bring it back to the woman we've been talking about since episode 1. The one who walked into her doctor's office tired and unsure. The one standing in the dumbbell rack holding the 5-pounders because everything she'd read told her that she's fragile now, that her body's broken, that she's missed her window. That's not true. The training that works for her is built upon the same principles that works for anybody. Her bones will respond. Her muscles will respond. Her body has remained adaptive. And the things that actually end lives at this stage, the heart disease, the fall, the fracture, all of it changes in her favor the moment she starts loading her body and starts doing her cardio. It's not perfect and it doesn't happen overnight, but she will adapt nonetheless. And she doesn't need a pink supplement any more than she needs pink dumbbells. And she doesn't need a proprietary protocol or coach with a certificate to get going either. Dr. Maria Fiatarone proved this with women in their 90s back in 1990. 4,000 women in a 2026 meta-analysis proved it again, and the answer hasn't changed. And it's not going to. It's never too late. You're not too far gone. And the best time to start is today. I'm Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum. That's Dr. Austin Baraki. This has been the Barbell Medicine Podcast, where we bring modern medicine to strength and conditioning and strength and conditioning to modern medicine. Please leave us a 5-star rating and a review. It really helps drive traffic to our podcast so we can keep bringing you all the latest nuance in health and fitness. If this has helped you, send it to the woman in your life or to her clinician. Something we hear a lot from people who run our programs is that they finish one and then they immediately want to start the next one, or that their goals or preferences shifted partway and they want to switch to something different, which is actually how training should work. It should adapt to you as things change. Now, the problem is buying programs one at a time. Every time that happens, well, that can be hard on the wallet. So we built Barbell Medicine Premium. One subscription and you get the entire program library in our app, all the strength, hypertrophy, conditioning, rehab, general fitness, beginner programs, and everything in between. You can switch whenever you want. And as new programs get added, you get them in the subscription. No per program fees ever. Austin and I build and maintain every program and podcast in both libraries. Same people, the same standards as everything else we put out, now all in one place. It's $19.95 a month, $199 for the year. You can cancel anytime. And if you already subscribe to Barbell Medicine Plus or the programming library separately, you can upgrade and we'll sort it out so that you're not paying twice. Link is in the description below. Check it out now.